Welcome. Welcome and good evening. I'm Brian Grigsby. I'm the president of Moravian College, and on behalf of the Board of Trustees, the faculty, and staff, I welcome you to Moravian College. For those of you who are visiting, and for our students who are here, you are in for a wonderful treat tonight. I think Reverend Lawson bridges for Moravian its history and its future. Moravian as a religion is the first peace religion. It sought to find nonviolent ways to enter into the world, into worlds of conflict. When the Moravians came to Bethlehem, they were the first to start educating the Native Americans, not by forcing them to learn English, but by the teachers learning Lenape. Today, we struggle with violence in our own country. We struggle with violence over the world, throughout the world, and we are trying to prepare all of you, all of our millennials, to lead us towards a more peaceful world. So it is a great honor to have such a distinguished person here who fought nonviolently through the 1960s for African American freedom and for freedom of all people, to give us his insight as we move forward in a country and try to become a more peaceful, more loving country. So with that, Bob Mayer is going to introduce our speaker.
It's wonderful to see so many people here tonight from both the Moravian College community and the broader Lehigh Valley community. I want to welcome you all. A group of students sat in the basement of a Nashville church. The year was 1959. They studied many subjects: the great religions of the world, the Bible, the philosophy of Gandhi and Henry David Thoreau, the history of nonviolence in the U.S., and the recent Montgomery bus boycott. These students studied in order to understand the philosophy of nonviolence. Moving beyond philosophy and theory, the students next practiced how to be nonviolent in the midst of a violence all around them. They role-played the world's ugliness and struggled to teach themselves and each other how to respond to that ugliness. And then the students gathered all they learned and all they became through their study, and they marched to the lunch counters of Nashville. They firmly but nonviolently asserted that all human beings deserve dignity. They encountered the ugliness they had role-played, and they acted as saints. In so doing, these young people transformed the world. Several years ago, one of those students, Representative John Lewis, stood on this very stage. He delivered a beautiful talk. When it was over, Professor Denton Borhaug and I were blessed to have a precious few minutes to sit and talk with him. I was a step or two behind. So when I sat down for the meeting, Professor Denton Borhaug had already asked a question. She, in fact, had asked the question that I would have asked. What was it like to sit in those classes with Reverend Lawson? I don't recall the specific answer Representative Lewis gave, but he tells us about those classes in his memoir. He states that Reverend Lawson was so gathered about his manner, the way he had of leaning back in his chair and listening, really listening, nodding his head, saying, "Yes, go ahead," very patient, very attentive. So a teacher who delivers a message and then sits back and listens. Reverend Lawson taught some great students in that workshop, people like John Lewis, like the amazing Diane Nash, Bernard Lafayette, all who went on to play major roles in the civil rights movement, that particular part of the movement that started in the late 50s and continues today. Reverend Lawson also played a major role throughout that time, teaching the Little Rock Nine about nonviolence, helping to form and shape the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee, training the Freedom Riders in nonviolence, becoming a Freedom Rider, helping to lead the Memphis sanitation workers' strike in 1968, and so much more. In fact, as we came to better understand in the last 2 days, Reverend Lawson taught nonviolence throughout the South and quietly shaped the heart of the civil rights movement. He continues his work for social justice to this very day. Reverend Lawson is an apt speaker to both bridge this year's in-focus topic of peace building with next year's topic of inequality, and to also serve as our 8th Peace and Justice Scholar in Residence. Reverend Lawson, the community of Moravian College is in the midst of a conversation about how to connect study in the liberal arts with experiential forms of learning that help students understand their life path. In my own attempt to understand that connection, a study of those amazing workshops in Nashville has enriched my thinking about how to help students link ideas with experience so they might take meaningful actions and find lives worth living. You have something quite significant to contribute to this conversation, and we have been blessed to have had you here to help us better understand our task. Your time here has given us some sense of what those students experienced in that Nashville basement. We at Moravian College are grateful to have been your students and to have shared the last few days to better understand you, your ideas, and your life work. We are in great need of your teaching. Thank you for being here. Thank you for this opportunity to hear that teaching one more time tonight. My friends, it is a great honor to introduce to you Reverend James Lawson.
Thank you. Thank you very much. Of course, I've heard of Moravian College long before this week. I've recognized it's been one of the top 50 liberal arts colleges across the country. I think that's one of the phenomenal pieces of our history, of the great numbers of Christian denominations and congregations that supported the raising up of colleges in this land from the Atlantic Ocean to the Pacific Ocean. I'm a product of one of those schools, and in fact, I'm a product of 3 of those schools, 4 of those schools, I should say. So it's a very real delight to be here. I want to thank Professor Mayer in person for being the one who first contacted me some time last year, and I've been very delighted that we were able to make these dates and that I've been here. You've given me a lot to think about. You've given me a sense of community and fellowship that I enjoy anyway, because I am convinced that we, the people of the earth, are far more human-friendly and human-oriented than the big power structures of the earth and the power structures even of our own nation. And you've helped me to see that very clearly. Of course, that's a part of my own lesson of life. I went into prison and lived in a close custody, maximum custody cell house for 7 months, and I found many professional folk who were muggers and murderers and people in for manslaughter, and yet I discovered that they were nevertheless quite human, in many ways quite alive. I went to India for 3 years, and in India, to my great joy, I discovered that the people called the Indians of India were very human, very much alive, different creeds, many, many languages, so many different customs and ways of living, but nonetheless were persons who were a part of the great flood of humanity. So my presence here has confirmed that in me once again, and I'm convinced of that. And so very happy and pleased to have been here this week. Now, I've chosen as a topic for this evening the theme, where do we go from here, chaos or community? And some of you scholars know that that's the title of Martin King's book's 1967 book. And I want to simply say to you that I use it again this evening, and I use it deliberately because I think it is a theme that reflected and represented, and that represents the nonviolent directed action dimension of what in the United States we call the civil rights movement. I want to push very hard at the notion that it is a question that King raised for all of us as a symbol and sign of the movement, and as in some ways, the initiator of taking a boycott, a bus boycott, not only adding to it that we're going to do this boycott with Christian thought in mind, but then also discovering the word and the phrase, the Gandhian phrase, nonviolence, and applying that term and that concept out of Christian thought to a boycott, becoming therefore the first advocate of life in the United States and or in Western civilization, who used the term nonviolent struggle to indicate the direction, the methodology, the philosophy, and the goals of an important movement in the United States. Perhaps the most important movement that has ever occurred in the United States. And I'm not trying to exaggerate, friends, at this point. But I want to see if I can, in lifting up this question, where do we go from here? Chaos or community, give you an impression of that struggle between the years of about 1953 and 73, that for me summarized the heart and the energy and the enthusiasm and the passion of what we call the civil rights movement. Now, in some ways, America uses the phrase civil rights movement in a fashion that has racist overtones and underbelly tones as well. Civil rights movement for many people in the United States means something that black people wanted to do. It is not seen as a part of American history, or even more so, it is not seen as a part of the experiment to establish in these shores a society not ruled over by aristocracy, though big business has become our aristocracy, not ruled by the top down, but a society where every woman, every man, every child is a part of the land and has access not only to the opportunities for life, but also is considered important in the way in which the society organizes itself indeed. We have never reached that place. Our democracy has always had forces of anti-democracy in the middle of them. We have laid in place systems of oppression and tyranny that we pretend are democratic. But the movement which I represented and continue to try to strive to see happen was a movement for all Americans. Civil rights movement doesn't represent what the movement was really about. Not that it was not for the rights of all people, but I want to push a little harder at this point. Civil rights term is an omnibus term, a big term, a large term, many, many different facets of it. I've counted at least 20 different dimensions of the civil rights movement that I saw and heard in the 50s and 60s. For an example, what America doesn't recognize is that when the NAACP in the late 20s, early 1930s, decided we are going to find young men, and that's the accurate way of describing the struggle at that time, young men who will go into law schools, we're going to find a law school that will do special work on how we can de-tyrannize the Constitution of the United States. And so Charles Houston, an attorney, became the dean of the School of Law of Howard University. This is 1930s. They began to recruit students for law. They used the Supreme Court as one of their laboratories for training. And then the NAACP Legal Educational Fund became a major force of defending the human rights of Negroes all over the country. All sorts of suits. And they trained local lawyers with the lawyers that they had especially trained at Howard to do the work. It is out of that came Thurgood Marshall. Now that strategy, one of the strategies of the omnibus civil rights movement, helped to clean up the Constitution so that in the 50s and 60s and 70s, major decisions were made that said this, which had never been said before, that the Constitution of the United States is inclusive of all people in the land and not just some. Never before had the Supreme Court made, in many instances, unanimous decisions that counterattack the tyrannies that we had permitted to grow in American society along with the society's growth itself. This is how segregation could become a part of our land in the 19th and 20th century especially. Though I want to hastily add to that racism in the United States began with the decimation of the Native American. The notion that the Native American was inferior, was other, was not equal to the settlers who came here from Europe. So the legislative strategy was a strategy that's helped the Constitution become an essential document for the rights of all life in our country. 20 different dimensions or more of the civil rights, what is called the civil rights movement. Every one of them, in one way or another, changed the face of the whole nation. I think of the sports dimension. I think of the entertainment dimension. I think of the church dimension. I think of the youth and student dimension. One could go down the line. An omnibus movement that affected the whole land. No central structures, no central organizing principle, often many disagreements, but of all of that movement, the direct action, nonviolent direct action dimension became the engine, the energizer, the power that pushed the conscience of American society to new levels. And so I want to talk for just a moment about that dimension of the movement. It can be called the Black Freedom Movement, and I proudly think that's a good title. It can also be called the Second American Revolutionary Period. That segment is not even known by most Americans today. The fact that the movement aroused a massive national, if not an international, conversation about the meaning of equality, liberty, and justice for all. One of the things that I like and remember so very well is the way in which personal freedom became an explosive issue in the 1960s and 1970s. It included, in fact, people disabled mentally and physically, beginning to wake up to the fact that we too are citizens of this land. We too are alive. We too have the right of access. We too have the right to be hired because of our capacities to work and our need for work. We too need to reshape the nature of the society. You and I may now take for granted the curbs all around our nation that are level with the street, at intersections and corners. That's a direct result of the civil rights movement, the nonviolent direct action dimension, because it passed and excited people in so many different ways that all over the land people decided, I am somebody and I'm going to do something about my situation. In the last 10, 15 years even, DREAM Act people, many undocumented students without the papers. Of course, I want to add quickly that in the sight of eternity, there's no human being who's illegal or undocumented. But nevertheless, I was a part of watching such students at UCLA and Los Angeles University of California break out of their fear and their hiddenness and decide, I am undocumented, that's true, but I am unafraid. I'm going to no longer hide from my status. I am a human being. I deserve access in every way possible. So the direct nonviolent action movement you can trace from 1953 to 1973, in which each year there were major campaigns of direct actions. In some years there were 1,600, 2,000 direct action entities, not just in the South, but very often operated outside the South. It is that direct nonviolent movement that I want in one way to celebrate. Congressman John Lewis has already been here, and he represents a part of that a great effort. The movement helped to wake up our nation. The movement helped to wake up many people. The movement helped to put nonviolent violence as a term in American language, in the United States language. So I want to say three things about it that's important for today and for tomorrow. First of all, that nonviolent struggle put a great deal of emphasis upon the power of persons, the capacity of each person to be a center of power and influence. We taught that that you are somebody. We taught you are salt, you are light. We taught that you have in your life the energy of the universe. And that's the power that not only helps you to be alive, and it also is within you the capacity to become more than you ever imagined you could become. John Lewis, in his memoir, writes, Walking with the Wind, that Jim Lawson saved my life. I dispute that. Each person must save their own lives. What occurred in those workshops for John and others was the fact that I pointed them in the direction that you, as a human being, alive, you have unknown power and capacity, and if you don't get trapped into accepting your identifications from the culture of our land, but launch the journey of who you are, you will be astonished of what can happen through your life. I remember the words of Robert Louis Stevenson, who said, "To be what you are, capable of becoming what you are becoming, is the sole role of life." And I want to press, especially for the college students, that whatever your reasons for being at Moravian, whatever your reasons for seeking a degree, I want to push you to the notion that through being at this place and through conversations and classes and books and learning and laboratories, you can provoke and stimulate and challenge who you are, not simply to be prosaic in the sense of what is America, but to be more than anything that America can teach you. We human beings have not tapped the potential of life, human life, by any means. We are not where we ought to be as a race, a human race. The American people are not far enough along the road to becoming a self-governing society that we might have been or that we still can be. Your gift of life from the universe, from God, is the most precious, surprising, challenging gift that you will ever have. You cannot measure its worth. You cannot buy it. So first of all, the purpose of every single one of us is to become that which we are becoming and that which we are capable of becoming, an imagery and likeness of life itself. We push that very hard in our teaching of what nonviolent struggle means, of what the Christian faith ought to mean. Not dogma, not belief systems, not rituals, some of which have lost their power and impression for us, not simply liturgies and prayers by any means, but the Christian faith rooted in the faith of Moses and the prophets is about taking hold of life's gift that is yours and using it to the hilt of your capacity. And as you use it, you'll discover unimaginable possibilities for your life where you never expected to be. And engaged in work and life that you'd never imagined possible. In many a mass meeting across the southeastern part of the country, because a mass meeting was a major tactic, we did not rely upon the media. I especially taught the fact, as Gandhi taught, that you must make your own media. You cannot rely upon the public media. You need to create newspapers and mimeograph machines and everything. Do what you have to do to spread your own word. Do lots of conversation. Do lots of meetings. So the mass meetings were one of the ways that we had in place for the purpose of getting our own people better informed. And I do not know how many mass meetings I went to in Mississippi or Alabama or Tennessee, where the preachers who would open up the meeting with a meditation, so-called, would thunder, you are somebody. You are salt. You are light. You are in the image of God, in the imagery, the mirror of life itself. So seize the gift and do all that you can do with it. I remember, for an example, in Selma, in '65, a 16-year-old boy, a high school boy, had gotten engaged in the voter registration campaign in Selma. He was on the bridge on that fateful Bloody Sunday. He came away from it with a concussion. He had to go to the hospital for treatment. They treated him, they wrapped his head in the tight bandages and whatnot, and he insisted upon leaving the hospital and being back at what was called the barricade, the Monday morning outside of Ellen Church. And he was there, head wrapped in bandages and all. And a couple of his friends began to taunt him about his being there and about the beating he took on the previous day. And he kept insisting, well, it doesn't matter, I love, he used the word love, I love my enemies, my opponents. And then a couple of reporters who were there began to taunt him about them, saying to him, they hate you. You have those bandages on the head because they hate you. And the boy responded, and I have kicked myself many times that I've not kept his name in my pocket and followed it where he is today. And the boy said something like this: I know they hate me. I know I took a bad beating yesterday, but I've got my dignity now, and I'm not going to let anyone take it away from me. I want the notion of the civil rights movement, and especially nonviolent dimension, to recognize that many young people and older people, many of the clergy who were engaged, the first element of our teaching and our pushing and our living, going in and out of jails, facing the violence, the first dimension of our thought from a nonviolence perspective is that you are a human being. You have life and love and power. And if you use it in conjunction with others, great things can happen. That is so, it seems to me, critical for our nation, because the opposition, the resistance, the tyrannies expressed in so many different ways in our land keep trying to strip people of their sense of strength and power. We keep pushing our people from the fact that the economy is so bad, you can't do anything about it, that's the way it ought to be. But a beginning place for change is to realize that there's nothing comparable to the gift of your life. To try to shape it and form it in such a fashion that you live through and are a conqueror of confusion and the rest. The second thing I want to lift up about this movement is best stated as a point in the words of a colleague and friend, historian Vincent Harding, who, in maybe before his death a couple of years ago, a historian from University of Chicago, but Vincent had been saying before his death something like this, and I want to use it. He would say in various places, I am a citizen of a country that does not exist. I am a citizen of a country that does not exist. And as I understand what Vincent Harding meant is something like this, that the movement brought people together and gathered people, and in place after place, we tackled the issues as we thought these had to be dealt with in that community and in that place. Because we had a sense of somebodyness, we were trying to shape where we were and as we were into the country that could be. That's part of the reason I think it's so very, very important for us to recognize the hard realities of the tyrannies that grew in America at the same time that an understanding, perhaps, of liberty grew. It's why one of the most essential things that occurred in the 50s and 60s is the legislation that presidents like John F. Kennedy and Lyndon Johnson began to think about, no doubt encouraged by people from the movement, by Martin King himself, from Roy Wilkins of the NAACP, Whitney Young from the Urban League, no doubt encouraged by men such as that, no doubt encouraged by people like Dorothy Hyatt, whose offices and home were in D.C. But as that struggle unfolded, the presidents who were prepared to think on behalf of all the people and were therefore prepared to try to see if they could pass legislation that would fulfill the vision of the movement for the changes the nation needed. We're celebrating the 50th year of the Selma March, which was about the fifth major campaign of the Selma Voting Rights Bill of 1965. I've read some of the stuff in the newspapers and magazines about it. And here's one of the places where they missed the boat entirely. They missed the boat at understanding that voting registration had always been a part of the struggle of the NAACP and other pastors and people who wanted change. But they missed the debate that went on between administrations and us, in which we were urged to get off the streets, to stop the demonstrations, and to work through voting registration. In fact, I sat in Robert F. Kennedy's office as Attorney General. He was then the Attorney General, where he proposed to us, and It was in 1961 in the Freedom Ride. To stop the Freedom Ride, stop the demonstrations. Voting registration will get you what you want. Voter registration will make the country better. Well, of course, it has not. So I want to lay that before you. Secondly, I want to insist that the Voting Rights Bill did not happen just because of the Selma movement in '65. It was the impact of 1955 in the bus boycott, 1956 in the Tallahassee bus boycott, 1959 and the Orangeburg economic boycott against Coca-Cola. It was the 1960 sit-in campaign that started the process of desegregation of public life in America. It was 1961 Freedom Ride. It was the 1962 Albany, Georgia campaign. It was the 1963 Birmingham campaign, the Great March on Washington, the first time that thousands of people petitioned the federal government in Washington, D.C., the first time any mass of American people assembled peacefully to say to the government, you must do the work that needs to be done. It's this time and place, the first time that had happened. 1964, it was a Freedom Summer when nearly 2,000 young adults from all across the country, many of them, most of them white, a number of them Jewish, came into the South, especially Mississippi, and worked with freedom schools and community centers through SNCC and through SCLC and through COFO. 65 happened because we grew in the previous years in our understanding of how to do it. It happened because there was a consciousness that had been raised among us, and Selma was seen as the next campaign that needed to happen. It happened because Martin King, coming back from the Nobel Peace Prize ceremonies in Oslo in December of 1964, went by the White House to visit with President Johnson and said to President Johnson, we need a voting rights bill. And President Johnson said, it can't be done. And King came back into the South and to SCLC and SNCC and other groups and said, we have to put on a campaign that will get it done, will give the president the power to get Congress to pass the bill. So it didn't happen just in 1965, because one of the great principles of social justice, social struggle is this, that it does not occur in the force that's necessary with one campaign or two campaigns. We need still in the United States today major campaigns of people if we're going to get the White House and Congress to do what the people want done in the United States. They will not do it without the pressure of the tramping feet of people from across the country. One of the aspirations of the movement of which I speak is we must learn to work and struggle, not for simply what we see in front of us, but we must work that we might be the citizens of a country that has not yet appeared. Maybe in some ways it has. I think so, even in our shores. In various ways out here, you see all sorts of ordinary men and women and young people doing extraordinary things. Not only the DREAM Act people, but the new sanctuary movement on the borders of Arkansas, Tucson. But the numbers of citizens in all sorts of organizations around the country who want change and are seeking to do what they can do. So maybe there are bits and pieces of the country that does not exist that we're citizens of. And the nonviolent struggle did represent a vision for all Americans. And we Americans must all envision the possibilities of our nation, not rooted in the White House only or primarily, not rooted in legislatures, but rooted in our own hearts and souls, which we're willing to share with one another. I have no doubt that the United States in the 21st century will have nonviolent campaigns that will shatter all of our notions about nonviolence of the past. It must be. My own purpose of continuing to speak and teach is that we the people of the United States need desperately to become engaged in our own present and future. We must set the agenda for business. We must dismantle the old tyrannies. They have not yet been thoroughly dismantled. We must provide the space for the new expressions of equality, liberty, and justice for all to emerge. We must do the work of justice, build where we are in every locality the possibility of a new nation, a new people, a new Los Angeles. A resident of a Los Angeles that does not yet exist, but will one day be and do. And then the final thing about the struggle that I lift up is that it was a nonviolent struggle, and we learned about it. We were experimenting in many ways. We discovered its enormous power. And living through those 17 years in the struggle in the Southeast has toughened my sense that of the massive possibilities of nonviolent work, conflict, and the rest. The struggle of the future must be nonviolent. Now understand that all that can be called the civil rights movement was by no means committed to the notion of nonviolent struggle. We had the fierce arguments among ourselves about the validity of mass action. Conventional wisdom in the United States still believes that if you don't look at a problem very long, you don't expose it, you don't put it on the table, it will gradually change and go away, or it would gradually get solved. Well, of course, as you well know, that simply doesn't happen. Tyranny will not dismiss, will not dissolve, racism will not dissolve in the United States by people waiting and watching and being patient. And I hang together, as some of you heard me say all week, I hang together the notion of the isms of racism and sexism and violence and plantation capitalism. The four are the major institutionalized ideologies of America that do more influence of decisions in America than what we know. I sometimes have said in various places within the churches of which I'm a part that more Christians make decisions acculturated by racism, violence, sexism, plantation capitalism than by the ethics of Jesus or the ethics of the soul. Our foreign policy is one of those policies. Our mythology of violence is another one of those policies in our country. Nonviolent direct action must become the politics of the 21st century if we're to save this experiment in self-government, and if we're to see that experiment lead us towards a country that does not now exist. And so let's understand that America is deeply rooted in its mythologies of violence. And in one way, I don't see myself as a full part of what is called peace activity and peace movements, because I happen to think that in the United States we cannot artificially make peace, because the tyrannies of ideas that are found out of racism are too fierce. They must be contended with. They must be stripped from our lives, personal and otherwise. The ideas of sexism are so embedded in American society that we're not going to make peace with ourselves until we dismantle those ideas and those tyrannies, those systems of oppression. So nonviolence is not, therefore, nonviolence is not, therefore, a sort of wimpy approach to the serious issues in our nation. It is, from my perspective, the science and the idea of the present that must one day govern our society. If our nation is to survive, our nation must begin the diminution of the mythologies of violence, and they must be replaced with the notion that compassion and care and truth and beauty are the weaponries that can help us find ourselves in a fresh way. We need that movement. So I push hard on the notion that the conflicts of the future, the conflicts of the present, you and I must deal with them from the perspective of our deepest sense of who we are as human beings, from the deepest sense of love and compassion and truth. If those values cannot resolve conflict, then that's precisely why nearly $1 trillion a year in our military security budgets have only caused the world to become more dangerous and more explosive. Have not succeeded and will not succeed. Martin King said this at one point, that the issue for us in the 20th century, and I say for the 21st century as well, is coexistence or co-annihilation. There are many voices in public radio, in public religion on the radio and on television, and also often on commentaries. Many voices that claim that Jesus will return again, that and not return, all the folk who are not baptized in his name will be slaughtered. What an awful thing to say, but they say it. There are voices in certain segments of the churches who maintain that Jesus is coming soon, and every human disaster is a sign that that's going to happen. I discarded that notion quite some time ago as a young person, as a student, as a pastor. The astrophysicist, the cosmologist among us tell us now that our sun has existed and this galaxy has existed for some 5 billion years, and they claim that it will continue to exist for another 5 billion years. So no matter how many disasters come, we're not going to see the sun fall or the star or the moon grow dark, perhaps in another 5 billion years. My sensibility is the disasters that we have put upon ourselves. They are human given. They are made by human decisions. They are made by principalities and powers. Plantation capitalism is committed in the United States to continuing the exploitation of the earth, to continue to see to it that the flow of wealth from Latin America and Asia and Africa is towards the banks of Europe and of Washington and New York. They speak of globalization in order to convince us that these issues are global, not human. They're not the problems of the earth, they're not the problems of the human race, but they are a commodity, a thing that has been thingified. But I say to you that there is sufficient evidence in our own nation to see that we are closer to being a political tyranny and a military state than we are closer to being a democratic society. And I would say to you, like Dietrich Bonhoeffer suggested to the people of Germany, or rather to Reinhold Niebuhr, in September of 1939, when he decided he could not stay in New York, but had to go back to Germany and do his work in Germany itself, not in the safety of New York. He said to Reinhold Niebuhr, we're going to have to face, he said German Christians, but I'll say we, are going to have to face the terrible alternative. He went on to speak of the fact of the death of the growth of Hitler, of Nazism. People were going to have to decide whether to take that as their course or to take a faithful stance to the agony of the gospel of Jesus. And I'm going to say something like that now, that we do have a choice in the United States, and each one of us can make it. We either join the enmity that seeks the despising of the human race and the despising of people, or we break with it, and we organize our neighbors and our friends. We wage campaigns in our locality to undo justice, to undo cruelty, to lift up care, to break the bonds of prison, jails, to lift up the need for civilian life, to break the bonds of addiction and the rest, and to lift the fact that we human beings can be healed, to break with the conventional wisdom that through voting and elections we can get it done, and to recognize instead that with the great history of the 20th century of nonviolence, we find ways not only personally to practice it, but we find ways to organize around a multiplicity of issues until one day the trample of millions of feet in direct action will put on the agenda of the American people and the powers that be an agenda that will allow for the access of life and purpose for every boy and every girl in every hamlet, every rural area, every urban, suburban intersection of our nation. This is going to happen in spite of us. But how much better it will be if people like you gathered in this sanctuary, gathered in this auditorium, join the struggle, regardless of risk, putting your personal talent and strength with the people who do most of the suffering for us in the United States. Break the chains of tyranny so that the possibility of equality, liberty, and justice can rise in ways that we can never imagine, but without which our lives are much the worse, but with which we will be astounded at what the gift of life means. Thank you.
Please be seated, everyone. We are going to take a few moments now for questions. I believe we have a couple of students who have microphones. And if you would raise your hand if you have a brief question for Reverend Lawson, and one of our students will find you and make sure that the microphone gets passed to you. So I see that we have someone right here in the middle. Reverend Lawson, would you mind? We've been making Reverend Lawson work very hard here the past 2 days. And we've discovered that part of the power of nonviolence is to give a person unbelievable stores of energy. Please.
Reverend Lawson, I have been very troubled by an issue lately. It seems that whenever we want to disempower people, we demonize them. Not we, but the media. And I am really struggling to figure out how in my heart and mind to think about these people in ISIS and how we can best deal with them in a peaceful manner that won't.
With ISIS?
Yes. I mean, I know it's not in the United States, but we are doing things, and it's like, okay, what they do is not not treating people very well, and it's hard not to demonize people that way, and I think that we cannot be demonizing people. If you could please help me with this, I would be most grateful.
Well, I don't think I can. I'm not sure I can respond to to what that which is troubling you. In the first instance, ISIS is the consequence of 100 years of bad policies in the part of the Western world, in their part of the world. That's number one. The world is in large measure, I maintain, the world that the empires have shaped and that in the last 100 years the United States has represented as the major power. ISIS did not shape the world in which they live. We did, in our society. Our big business, our militarism, our CIA, our Pentagon. The world is not a world that the lonely women and children refugees in the Sudan or in the Congo created. So we, in fact, can continue to explode violence with ISIS, but there's no indication at all that as we do that, the sense of extreme anger and outrage on the part of Islamic people, including young men from our own society in Canada and Europe, will not be even more outraged. There has to be a break with the policy of fighting everything in the world with more fighting of a violent character. There has to be an effort to de-escalate the violence. And we've come to the place now where our State Department, that used to be peopled with many diplomats, with historians and with foreign languages and with people who are experts in the cultures of other lands. And those people have literally been all driven out of the State Department. The State Department is now a sub-department of the CIA and of the Pentagon. Period. That's happened in my lifetime. So you cannot do anything about Isaac, no matter how horrible we think it is, and it is. What we can do something about is our own place where we live. We can do some work. I think, as I've tried to say, the United States needs what Martin King called a spiritual, moral, political revolution, and that revolution must still take place. We're not going to stop making people go off in the deep end with their insanity for as long as we see the only option of the power of violence. So.
Other questions?
I didn't, oh, okay.
Right behind you, the gentleman has a question. Oh, or in the front, that's fine, great. Take that one first.
You were talking about the important role that the Supreme Court played in the 1950s and 60s. With the movements for justice that you're seeing now, could you comment on what role the Supreme Court is playing in American society and the Roberts Court?
Oh, absolutely. The Roberts Court is trying to move the Supreme Court and law decisions back to 1896, back to 1871, back to 1888, back to the beginning of the nation when, of course, as the nation began to form itself in the 18th century, the notion that Indians were included, African Americans were excluded, women were excluded, Mexican Americans were excluded. So that's what the court is about. And I did not say that as I should have into this evening, because it has to be said that the opponents of democracy, the proponents of big money, big military, are better organized today than they've ever been organized in my own lifetime. They've gained more victories in our country than they deserve to gain. And the Roberts Court represents the segregationist senators and governors and members of Congress who opposed the changes of the 60s, 70s, and 80s. And they morphed themselves, they reorganized. They call themselves the Republican Party now, they call themselves the Tea Party. They call themselves Democratic even, because the Democratic Party is at fault as well. And so the resistance movement is more fierce, and the Roberts Court represents the resistance movement that is rooted in the worst elements of American history.
First, I'd like to thank you, Reverend Lawson, for having such a strong impact on a group of students that I taught in the Peace Studies program at Lehigh University. I suppose there are many such groups of students whom you have impacted and you don't know about it, but thank you for that. That happened through the film entitled We Were Warriors that covers the campaign for the sit-in in Nashville. What I'd like to ask is whether you see some hope that churches will turn away from being acculturated to the capitalist system in the United States and take up instead the teachings of Jesus. In other words, do you see some hope for the conversion of the churches?
Well, all across the country there are pockets of people of the churches, and there are pockets of congregations that are doing a far better job of trying to work out and live out the teachings of Jesus. The Resurrection Church right in Allentown Pennsylvania, here with Pastor Greg Edwards, is one illustration of what is going on in many parts of the country. These are unheralded illustrations, but they're going on. So, yes, one day maybe, in my own denomination, we will re-emerge from our slumber and our fear and begin to take hold of the work such as Resurrection Church and all, and make things happen again. Yeah, I haven't given up at all on that basis. The central hope that I have is that in the people with whom I associate across the years, and today, people with whom I'm associated at UCLA, in the Holman Church, in the All Saints congregation, in many different congregations in Los Angeles, the hope is that that element of the church where there's I think, a great degree of steadiness and diligence and growth, that wave will take over again the entire church. That's my hope. That's my great hope. My hope is in the people and what many people are doing all around the world. But the institutions, I think in many cases, are in trouble. I think our political system is in terrible turmoil. Those systems have to be stripped of their fear and of their powers and replaced.
Maybe two more questions at the most. I see one back here and one back here. Should we start right here?
Hi, thank you so much for spending your time with us. I have a question in regards to the book, The Children by David Halberstam. He writes about an exchange between you and a motorcycle gang leader. Do you remember the encounter?
Okay, I cannot quite hear you.
In the book, The Children,
Yes.
by David Halberstam, he writes.
Yes.
He writes about an exchange between you and a motorcycle gang leader. Do you remember? So you remember that encounter? And I was wondering what was going through your mind when you were being spat on, and what the situation was about. What was going through your head at that time?
I don't yet hear what the incident is.
With the motorcycle gang leader?
Oh. Okay. Well, very often, part of my work and teaching has been that when we face violence and have to deal with it, then that should help us do some deep conversation and strategizing and try to figure out how to get around or through or over the violence, how not to allow the violence to interrupt and change the struggle. Its sense of being, its sense of direction, its actions, and the rest. So in the case of that story that Halberstam has in that book, if you get into a violent scene, sometimes it's quite possible, if you stay calm and cool and try to deal with the assailant, you can do what Richard Gregg called moral zuzitsu, and what Gene Sharp calls political zuzitsu. That means that you may be able to find an opening with the assailant that surprises the assailant, that causes the assailant to move away from the violence he wants to do or is trying to do and move back to a more human posture. And so the thing that was on my mind in that instance and a number of other instances is one, to stand calm, control the fear, and secondly, think quickly and see what is going on here, And thirdly, see if there's an opening, if there's a surprise place. Now, actually, I didn't learn that on my own. I learned that from John Wesley, the founder of Methodism, because John Wesley in his journal describes at least 5 times when mobs met him in the streets of England in different cities. 5 times, at least 5 times. And he learned, he taught himself not to be afraid when he got dragged by his hair through the street. Tried to get onto his feet. He tried to spot the leaders in the crowd of men who were assaulting him. And then he would throw off his hat so they could see his eyes and his face. And he would try to see if he could get a question into the picture at a person that he thought was a leader, and so get that leader to stop. So he was never battered or lynched, because every one of those 5 times where he was mobbed, he walked through them and got managed. And so in an instant like that, your mind has to be not on your own safety, and not on fear, but your mind has to be looking at the scene and figuring out if there's a possibility. Is there any? So that was what was on my mind in that incident.
Let's take one final question back here, please.
Hi, Reverend Lawson. Thank you so much for being here, and particularly for your help in starting the Freedom School movement in Allentown. I think that's such important work. You talk about the need to organize around a multiplicity of issues, and with all the issues that we face today, whether it's police violence or climate disruption or economic instability, if you were a college student at this point, how would you decide which issue to focus on, or how do you go about figuring out how to meld those issues together and finding a point of entry into them?
Well, I cannot answer your question. We have to do that for ourselves. I mean, one of the actions that I took in college, I think I was a sophomore at Baldwin Wallace. One of the actions I took, a colleague and I took, was international students were complaining to a number of people that we need to get our hair cut, and we can't get our hair cut anywhere in Berea. So another friend and I took the time out one week to do a survey of the barber shops. There were 5 or 6 of them. We went to each barber shop. I went in first, and then Jim followed me. We found out that 3 of the places we first went into refused to cut my hair. They would have nothing to do with any kind of change. We went, I think, to the 4th or 5th barbershop. Again, I went in first, Jim followed. The barber, when I walked in, was not busy. He took me immediately into his chair and cut my hair. Jim followed me in. So then we tried to get fraternities and other male students of the college to go to that barber. As much as they could go to that barber, and he took various students from Africa and Latin America and Asia, and did cut their hair. So you have to make your own decision about that. That's why I like the Gandhian methodology, which I have tried to summarize in 4 steps rather than 10 steps. But his first word is investigate. But he also uses the word focus. He also uses the word priority. All of us are bombarded by too many things that we have to care for and do. We have to make the decision. We cannot do everything anyway. So do some jawboning around it and make a focus. The Nashville story of 1959-60 we spent in Nashville 6 months just to decide we're going to have a nonviolent campaign in Nashville, and we're going to start the desegregation of downtown Nashville. There were a multiplicity of issues that were on the table. We tried to do a real assessment of what the situation was in Nashville. We took 6 months to do it, meeting every week, every Saturday morning. And in that time, we settled on a single target, which was a big target, because that meant restrooms that needed to be renovated, signs that had to come down, a different attitude on the part of clerks in the downtown area. The managers had to do the work of training their people to give hospitality to every potential customer, which they did not do, incidentally. So while it was a big issue, and I was startled when it emerged as the issue and wasn't sure how to go about it, but it became a priority. It became the issue we chose out of many, many other issues, and it was the right issue. It was the first issue that should have been tackled. I mean, I say that now afterwards, you know. So a lot of times, if we did that kind of thinking and planning, we will stumble upon what is the best issue, that in turn will not only be an issue that you know is right, but in turn will lead you to the next campaign, and will lead you to the next issue. Will lead you to the next issue. So work to do it yourself. You'll let us take this moment to redress.
President Grigsby, it's my privilege to present to you for special recognition the Reverend James Lawson. The mission statement of Moravian College states that a Moravian education prepares men and women for advanced study and continuous learning, individual achievement, and leadership and service for the common good. The individual I present today embodies the intellectual and moral tradition of justice, peace building, and care for the common good in a way that deeply challenges and spurs all of us in deep examination of our own lives. Reverend Lawson is a pillar of the 1960s civil rights movement, having trained many key leaders in the strategy and philosophy of nonviolence, and is one of the most important advocates for nonviolence in American history, and indeed the world. As a young adult, Reverend Lawson refused service in the Korean War and served 13 months in prison. After his release, he went to India to study Gandhian nonviolent resistance, and then to Oberlin College in Ohio for a master's degree in theology. While at Oberlin, he met Dr. King, who convinced him to come south and help in the civil rights struggle. Reverend Lawson responded to Dr. King's call and went to Nashville, where he enrolled in the Vanderbilt Divinity School and also began working for the Fellowship of Reconciliation. As part of his work with the fellowship, he began holding classes in the basement of a church to teach the philosophy and social science of nonviolent direct action. The classes attracted students from area colleges, many of whom went on to play key leadership roles in the civil rights movement, including Diane Nash, John Lewis, James Bevel, and Bernard Lafayette. This teaching and moral formation spurred college students to become key leaders in the sit-ins and freedom rides that occurred in the early 1960s. Reverend Lawson also played a key role supporting students to found and lead the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee, SNCC, an organization at the core of the movement. The stamp of his grassroots leadership and moral nonviolent formation of civil rights leaders is also found in the 1963 Birmingham Children's Crusade, the 1963 March on Washington, Mississippi Freedom Summer, the Mississippi Freedom Democratic Party, in the Albany movement, in the Selma movement for voting rights, the Meredith March, the 1966 Chicago Open Housing Movement, the anti-Vietnam War movement, and beyond. Throughout campaigns like those mentioned above, Reverend Lawson remained connected to Martin Luther King Jr., maintaining an important influence on Dr. King's evolving philosophy of nonviolence. According to Dr. King, Reverend James Lawson is the leading theorist and strategist of nonviolence in the world. Reverend Lawson moved to Memphis, Tennessee in 1962 and became pastor for the Centenary Methodist Church. In 1968, when the Memphis sanitation workers went on strike, Reverend Lawson served as a leader for that movement. At the behest of his old friend James Lawson, Dr. King came to Memphis in April to support that strike. On April 3rd, Dr. King was assassinated at the Lorraine Motel. In 1973, Reverend Lawson became a board member of the Southern Christian Leadership Conference and served as president of the Los Angeles chapter from 1979 to 1993. He moved to Los Angeles in 1974 to lead the Holman United Methodist Church, where he served for 25 years before retiring in 1999. He's continued to train activists in nonviolence and to work in support of diverse peace-building and justice issues, such as immigration rights in the United States and the rights of Palestinians, opposition to the war in Iraq, and workers' rights to a living wage. In 2004, he received the Community of Christ International Peace Award. In his work as a university professor, Reverend Lawson has helped to develop important movements in higher education, such as his work with the California State University Northridge's Civil Discourse and Social Change Initiative. He also has been active with the Ralph J. Bunche Center for African American Studies at UCLA, ranked among the nation's top academic research centers in African American studies. Reverend Lawson's work as a peace builder and nonviolent strategist for a more just society continues up to the present. Just last year, he came to Allentown to work with members of the community and the Resurrected Community Development Corporation on their Campaign for Change by hosting community-wide training sessions on the history of the civil rights and nonviolence movement. The Campaign for Change is the nonviolent direct action student response to the racist barriers that are embedded in the academic environment within the Allentown School District. This group is raising awareness about the injustices currently happening in schools and developing ways of addressing them. Among other actions, Resurrected Life worked to create the James Lawson Freedom School in Allentown to help young African American students celebrate their identity and history and develop their full potential as leaders and contributors to a just society. President Grigsby, for his dedication to civil rights and nonviolent training in the interest of building a more peaceful society, and for his continuing courage in the face of inequality, I am indeed honored to present Reverend James Lawson for conferment of the honorary degree of Doctor of Humanities.
Reverend Lawson, the highest honor any college can give is that of an honorary degree for your service and dedication to both our society, our country, and humanity. For dedicating your life to promoting civil rights and nonviolence to build a more peaceful society, and for your dedication to the highest ethical standards and moral principles by the authority granted by the Commonwealth of Pennsylvania and by the authorization of the Board of Trustees, I confer upon you the honorary degree of Doctor of Humanities, in witness whereof I present you with these diplomas and direct that you be invested with the insignia appropriate to this degree. Congratulations, you're officially a hound.
You may regret, I'm now a Moravian. Thank you.